Long before the United States drew borders across the Rocky Mountains, the Ute people lived across a vast and demanding land. Their territory stretched from the high plateaus of present-day Utah to the deep valleys of western Colorado and into northern New Mexico. It was a land of snow-fed rivers, wide sage plains, and rugged peaks. The Utes knew this country intimately. They followed the seasons, hunted elk and bison, gathered plants, and moved with a rhythm shaped by centuries of survival. The land was not something to be owned. It was something to live within. Spanish explorers were the first outsiders to reach Ute territory in the 16th century. They brought horses, which transformed Ute life. The Utes became skilled horsemen, expanding their hunting range and power. With horses came trade, new weapons, and new dangers. Disease arrived quietly and killed many. Conflict increased as rival tribes competed for horses and resources. Still, for generations, the Utes remained largely independent, adapting without losing control of their homeland. By the early 19th century, the world around the Utes began to change faster than ever before. The United States pushed west after independence, driven by trade, settlement, and the belief that expansion was inevitable. Trappers and traders entered Ute land, followed by missionaries, soldiers, and settlers. At first, contact was limited. Many Ute leaders believed these newcomers would pass through, as others had before. They were wrong. Pressure increased after the Mexican-American War in 1848, when the United States claimed vast western territories. Suddenly, Ute land was no longer distant wilderness. It was valuable. Gold discoveries in Colorado in 1858 triggered a massive influx of miners and settlers. Towns appeared almost overnight. Trails cut across hunting grounds. Rivers were diverted. Game grew scarce. Promises made to the Utes were quickly broken. Early treaties were signed under unequal conditions. Ute. After the violence of 1879, the atmosphere around the Utes changed completely. What had once been described as management problems on the frontier was now framed as a crisis. Newspapers across the country demanded action. Politicians spoke of safety, order, and progress. Very few mentioned broken treaties or corrupt agents. The Utes were judged as a single body, regardless of who had taken part in the fighting. Military control tightened quickly. Ute bands were ordered to remain under close supervision. Movement was restricted. Hunting outside assigned areas was treated as a crime. For a people whose survival depended on mobility, this was devastating. Game had already declined due to overhunting by settlers. Now, even reaching remaining hunting grounds risked punishment. Chief Ute continued to act as mediator, but his position was becoming impossible. He had spent years urging cooperation, signing treaties, and restraining younger warriors. Many Utes had followed his lead, trusting that compromise would protect their people. Instead, they saw their land shrink and their autonomy disappear. Respect for diplomacy weakened, replaced by anger and despair. In Washington, lawmakers debated removal. Colorado politicians argued that the state could not develop while native people controlled valuable land. Mining interests pushed aggressively for access. Railroad companies saw the mountains as routes and resources. The conclusion was clear. The Utes had to go. The decision focused especially on the White River and Uncompahgre Utes. These groups were ordered to leave Colorado and relocate to reservations in Utah. The Southern Utes were allowed to remain on a much smaller reservation, but even that was reduced again and again. The policy was not negotiation. It was enforcement. Removal was not a single event. It was a process filled with delays, confusion, and suffering. Soldiers escorted Ute families across harsh terrain. Winter conditions made travel deadly. Supplies PR. As the Utes settled into life on the reservations in Utah and the reduced lands in southern Colorado, the nature of conflict changed. The fighting had stopped, but pressure never did. The federal government now focused on reshaping the Utes into what it considered American farmers and laborers. This was presented as progress. For the Utes, it felt like another kind of war. Reservation life was marked by dependency created on purpose. Hunting, once central to Ute survival, was restricted or banned. Without access to traditional food sources, families relied on government rations. When crops failed or supplies were delayed, hunger followed. This dependency weakened independence and made resistance risky. Agents enforced rules that had little understanding of Ute culture or environment. Farming was encouraged on land with poor soil and limited water. When crops failed, Utes were blamed for laziness rather than the impossible conditions. This narrative spread beyond the reservations and shaped how the public viewed native people. Land loss did not stop with removal. Through allotment policies, communal land was broken into individual parcels. Any unused land was sold to non-native settlers. This process, promoted as a way to encourage ownership and responsibility, resulted in massive loss of Ute land. What remained was fragmented and often economically useless. Alcohol was another destructive force. Introduced and then poorly regulated, it caused serious harm in communities already under stress. The government often blamed native people for these problems, ignoring its own role in creating the conditions that allowed them to spread. Despite these challenges, Ute leaders continued to adapt. Councils formed to negotiate with federal officials. Some leaders learned English and legal systems to defend their rights. Others focused on cultural preservation, ensuring songs, ceremonies, and language were passed down. Religion became a battleground. Missionaries tried to rep. By the late 20th century, the Ute people were living in a world very different from the one that had existed before the wars. Roads crossed former hunting grounds. Cities and ski resorts stood where seasonal camps once moved with the weather. Yet the Utes were still here, shaped by loss but not defined by it. The long aftermath of the Ute Wars had become a test of endurance rather than force. Legal battles replaced armed conflict. Ute leaders and attorneys began turning to courts to defend treaty rights that had been ignored for generations. Water rights became one of the most critical issues. In the arid West, water meant survival, development, and power. The Utes argued that their treaties guaranteed access to water from rivers that originated on their ancestral lands. These cases were slow, expensive, and exhausting, but they mattered. Some victories came. Court rulings affirmed certain tribal rights and recognized past injustices. These wins did not restore lost mountains or erase suffering, but they gave the Utes leverage and visibility. For the first time in generations, the federal government was sometimes forced to listen. Economic development became another path toward survival. Tribal governments invested in energy resources, agriculture, and businesses. Oil and gas development brought revenue to some Ute communities, especially the Ute Mountain Ute and Uinta and Ouray reservations. These projects were controversial, balancing economic need against environmental and cultural concerns. The debates themselves reflected something important. The Utes were deciding their own future again. Cultural revival gained strength alongside political and economic efforts. Language programs were created to teach younger generations words nearly lost to boarding schools and forced assimilation. Elders worked closely with schools and families to preserve oral histories. Songs once sung quietly were performed openly again. Ceremonies continued, not as relics of the past,